Good day to you. I was very pleased to see that in this class there are several students who have traveled to other countries across the world, and actually some students in this class actually are from other countries. Because across the world it's really fascinating to see how different countries have different media systems that operate in different ways. Here in the US, it's easy to grow up thinking that all countries have the same kind of media system, which is to say that when you watch TV, for example, that every show begins at the top of the hour and ends at the bottom of the hour and has some advertisements. And if it's a sitcom, there's some gentle humor that's built around the advertisements, and it's going to, whatever the problem is, resolve itself by the end of the show. That's not the case in some other countries. For example, in Britain, many shows begin at 7:05 in the evening, or 7:10 in the evening, or 7:40 in the evening. And if those shows are being aired on the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, those shows are not having any commercials whatsoever. It's just a small example of how media can be very different depending on what country you're in. And so that's how this final chapter in the book ends things. It talks about global media, and that's how we're going to talk today. We're going to talk about global media and what some of the differences are across the world. But first, the chapter starts with an approach to studying media in different countries. It is based on what is the philosophy of the media system that is operating in that particular country. And there are several philosophies that have been grown up. They used to be called four theories of the press, but really what they're about is philosophies of how a media system should operate. And so the first philosophy grew up in the early 1400s. It was called the Authoritarian Theory of the press. And it basically was in a time period where the press were said to be instrumental in making sure that a country doesn't fall to its aggressive neighbors, a country that would be vulnerable because of the threat from the outside. And so in that kind of a country, in that kind of a time period, the authoritarian theory was at play. And the authoritarian theory basically said that the press, meaning the media, must serve the government. The press must be at the disposal of the government. And at the head of the government was an all-knowing ruler, an authoritarian figure who knew better than most people, and that's why the press and government had to follow the ruler's lead. In authoritarian media systems, if you break the rules, if you try to criticize the government, it's perfectly legitimate to put you in jail. It's perfectly legitimate to punish you by torture and other kinds of drastic measures that involved an authoritarian rule. This is the way that media operated in the 1400s and 1500s because of a concern that if the media criticized the country or the government, then the country could fall and be susceptible to its neighbors. Next up is the theory called the communist theory. The communist theory is similar to the authoritarian theory, but instead of the media just being a servant of the government, the media are actually run by the government. We still have communist media theory operating today in some countries, Cuba, for example, North Korea, for example. In the communist system, the media are owned by the government, and the media are supposed to be tools of the government in the sense that they are promoting the government's objectives. The media are not allowed to criticize the government. This is the way it was when I went to China, that you cannot criticize anything that the government is doing. It's seen as disloyal, and since there is only one party, one political party in a communist nation, that is the Communist Party, there is no competing political party, why question what the party has in mind for the population? And many times a communist government sets 5-year goals for the production of food or health improvements, and the media is expected to go out and to support those goals by not criticizing it, but simply reporting this communist leader is making this speech about this particular health goal, and we should all get behind it because it's a noble idea. Next up is the philosophy or the theory that's called Libertarian Theory. This is the theory that is most at play in the United States. It's a complete opposite reaction to communist and authoritarian theory. Libertarian theory basically says that the government should be out of the way of media, and media should be privately owned by companies, and the media should be left to run itself, and it should be free from government interference. The idea behind libertarian theory is that the population is seeking to develop itself in such a way that everybody has a voice and everybody has an opinion and everybody ultimately has a vote. That's what the libertarian theory tries to emphasize. In actual fact, it is an ideal libertarian theory because here in the United States, we like to think that the government doesn't have control over the media, but in actual fact, as the book points out, there is a lot of control of the media by the government. For example, in the area of obscenity, you're just simply not allowed to use profane language in broadcast media, otherwise you'll be fined. That's kind of an authoritarian measure, to fine a person $325,000 for uttering a swear word. And so even in a libertarian country like the United States, there still is government control. Next up is the philosophy called social responsibility philosophy. We discussed that in the last chapter as well. This is a philosophy that grew up from the Hutchins Commission and basically says that the media should be responsible and that the government, if there's any role for the government is to operate as a referee when there is unfair play. And so, for example, if too many companies are owning too many media properties in the United States, the government is, under the social responsibility theory, allowed to step in and say, we're going to force this company to break up and to sell off some of its assets so that there is more competition in this particular market. We actually saw that in the history of NBC, which owns so many radio networks and was said to be so powerful that the government broke it up and forced it to sell off part of its network, the NBC network, which later became ABC. So the social responsibility theory is a fairly new theory, and it operates under the principle that media have a responsibility to society, not just to make money, not just to serve the government, but to serve the people and try and better the nation. That's what social responsibility is all about. And then finally, there's the developmental theory. And this theory, developmental theory, is applied mostly to developing nations. And by the way, if you use the term third world nation, it's not really appropriate in today's day and age. A third world nation is a put down to those nations. It's describing nations that are not aligned with either the Soviet nations, which were the second world nations, or the U.S. nations, which were the first world nations. And so if you weren't aligned with one of those two countries, you were labeled a third world nation, and that's speaking about a term that was used in the 1940s. So today we don't use third world, we use developing countries. And in developing countries, many of them are in Africa, many of them are in Latin America, the fundamental principle behind this theory is that the media should help the country develop. The media need the government, and the government need the media. Both need each other because you're talking about a poor country, a country that is threatened by disease, a country that is threatened by disasters, a country that is threatened by economic hardship. And so the media should spend its time educating the public about how to take care of itself health-wise, hygiene-wise, birth control-wise. The media should help the government promote new roads, bridges, playgrounds, schools that are being built. And the government in turn should provide the media with the information that the media need to report on what's happening. So that's a developmental theory. Now, the scholar Alan Wells decided that there's a different way to approach media to try and understand how media operate in each country. And instead of looking at theories, Alan Wells says there's basically 5 dimensions of media that you can look at to understand how a media system operates uniquely in a particular country. One dimension is control. Who controls the media? Is it the government? Is it the media properties themselves? Is it corporations? If you can find out who controls the media, you can learn a lot. Secondly is finance. Who pays for the media? Is it advertisers? Or is it like in some other countries where you pay for a license fee when you purchase a radio or TV set, you pay a license fee, and then those monies are used to fund programming and fund content? Or is it like communist countries where the government flat out pays for media? If you find out who finances media, you can learn a lot about a media system. Then there's programming goals. Do countries have goals with their programming that they're trying to simply make money from the TV shows and the radio programs and the newspaper articles? Or are they trying to do something else? Are they trying to lift the spirits of a country? Are they trying to get the country behind it, behind a nationalism, a sense of nationalism and patriotism? Are they trying to get the media to frame another threatening country as a country that's evil? What are the programming goals of a country? Next up is the target audience for the media system. Who is the content being created for? Is it for teens? Is it for elderly citizens? Is it for males? Is it for females? Who is the audience? And finally, what is the feedback mechanism? Is there a feedback mechanism? Does the TV station or radio station or magazine or newspaper have a method for the public, the audience, to get in touch with the producers of the content, to complain about the content, to ask that the content be corrected, to ask that the content go in different directions? What is the feedback mechanism? Now the book launches into areas of the world to try and give some, I guess you would call it, common themes to how countries' media systems operate in these regions of the world. It's a difficult enterprise to do, but it takes on, first of all, Canada, Western Europe, and Great Britain, and it talks about how in these countries there is a great tradition of public media. That is, media that are funded by the government or funded by license fees. The most famous of which is the BBC World Service, the British Broadcasting Corporation's World Service. It's based in London, and it has a television dimension to it. It has a radio dimension to it. Here at East Stroudsburg University, we actually carry the BBC on WESS radio. The BBC is known as the most impartial and well-respected news service across the world. It doesn't just offer news programming, it also offers comedy. In the area of radio, it offers pop music. The BBC is firmly embedded in the lives of many people in Britain because it is offering programming and content that they want to hear. It's funded by a license fee. You buy a TV set and you have to pay a license fee, and those monies go towards the BBC. The BBC is not allowed to run any advertising. It's typical of public service media that you can find in Canada, Western Europe, and Britain. In Canada, you have the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. In France, you also have a similar France Television, TV France. And in other countries in Europe, you have the same idea, which is public media competing with private commercial media. Moving to Central and Latin America, these are regions that have been in the past defined somewhat by some turbulence between in the government and also in amongst the population, and some factions that have tried to separate from nations that they're operating in. For example, Nicaragua. In these regions of the world, probably the most famous thing that media programming is known for is the telenovela, or the telenovel. Telenovela is a kind of novel on television or a soap opera. We discussed it earlier in the class. Brazil and Mexico tend to be the biggest players in Latin America and Central America when it comes to media systems. They create more content than other countries that is carried around the world, including the telenovela. Next, we move to the Islamic countries and the Middle East. These countries still largely have authoritarian media systems, and the media systems are essentially guided by the religions of the countries that they are in, mostly the various denominations of the Muslim religion, Egypt and Iran and Iraq and Kuwait and so on. In these countries, the media serve the purposes of the religious goals of the government. And so if you have a country like Iran or Iraq or Egypt, the mores that are communicated by television shows are designed to support religious principles. So, for example, females are not permitted to be, in most of these countries, to be shown with their skin exposed. They have to be covered up, because that is one of the principles of Islamic religion, is for the dress and the attire of the female, not to present the female as being available. So in Islamic and Middle East countries, you still have a very strong authoritarian system. In Africa, again, you have a lot of conditions of poverty, and also you have conditions in Africa where written languages are not used. That's the case in Ghana, Africa, which is a country that I have visited. In Ghana, Africa, you have many tribes who do not have a written religion, do not have a written language. And that means you can't have a newspaper in these countries because you can't read it. And so the most important medium in many African countries is radio, actually, because it's based on oral speech. Radio is very, very important in many African countries. Africa is defined by developing media. Media is goal is to try and build up the nation, to build up the particular country in Africa that it's operating in, and to not tear it down. Then we come to Russia and the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, etc. These countries used to operate under the old Soviet communist system where the media was controlled and owned by the government. Today you still have a lot of the same features in place. Media that are unfriendly, for example, to Vladimir Putin in Russia are shut down or fined. So you have sort of the guise that media are able to operate freely, but in actual fact, you have to pay to the highest bidder to have a television property, to have a radio property, to have a newspaper property, and if you get out of line, you could be imprisoned. In Asia, we also have what would be considered to be authoritarian media systems. China is a good example of a media system that is authoritarian and communist. The media have to support the government. Almost every single day there's a photograph on in the newspaper that is showing a Chinese leader that is giving a speech or making a presentation or visiting with a group of people. It's very much the media systems in Asia, very much about supporting governments and making sure that the media systems are serving a greater good of the entire society rather than individual needs, which is what you'll find in libertarian systems. Finally, the chapter ends with dangers to journalists, making the point that it is a dangerous occupation to be a journalist in some countries. Iraq was the most dangerous country to work in as a journalist. Mexico is still a dangerous country. The Middle East is a dangerous country. If you're operating in these countries and you're truly serving the goals of journalism, you're reporting on problems. And those problems would be inconvenient to many governments. And so journalists can go missing, they can be threatened, they can be put away, they can have their families threatened. And this is something that is of serious concern if you want to be an international journalist in countries that have turbulence. So this then wraps up our chapter on global media. I hope you have a great day.